Uhuru. My name is Dr. Aisha Fields, and I'm a member of the National Central Committee of the African People's Socialist Party. Any honest discussion on human rights must acknowledge the fact that the capitalist world economy was founded on the colonial enslavement and forced dispersal of African people and the theft of the land, labor, and resources of indigenous peoples around the world. Capitalism is maintained through extreme violence and the imperialist domination of the vast majority of the world's people. So, to fight for human rights must mean to fight for national liberation and self-determination of African and all other oppressed peoples, which is the key to wiping colonial capitalism off of the planet Earth.
What anti-imperialism and human rights looks like to me is sovereignty for all, free housing, free healthcare, free education. They're all human rights to me.
It's the right to live without fear of your life being taken over a mere traffic stop. It's without fear of, because of the color of your skin, your life doesn't matter. So let's ask ourselves, what is basic human rights? Should we have to pay for healthcare to stay alive? That should be a human right. Should I have to fear the police from pulling me over or saying the wrong thing or reaching for my ID and I'm dead? Peace officers should make it a human right to save lives and not take them.
Since the inception of this country, marginalized and oppressed people, the least of these, have been fighting for basic human rights, for self-determination, for dignity, for just jobs, for healthy housing, for the right to education, for access to healthy food, to adequate health care, for freedom. And the times that we are living call for a radical, unapologetic truth-telling. This is not a time to respond with lukewarmness, but to respond boldly and with courage, because we have seen shackles loosed on the arms and legs of slaves. We've already seen stone walls come down in the quake of resistance of our LGBTQ siblings. We have seen domestic workers and labor workers and migrant workers and student groups and religious leaders and barrios all across the United States. We've seen people like you and me rise up to say that freedom and justice and truth are ours, and we will fight for it until justice rolls down like the waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Even though the vast majority of people in the US believes that healthcare is a human right, we don't yet have a political system here that upholds the will of the people. What we're told is a democracy is actually just the will of the powerful few being imposed on the rest of us. It's a human rights violation when millions of people are given addictive and deadly painkillers as a substitute for the healthcare that they really need. It's a human rights violation when people have to post fundraisers on the internet to beg for the money to cover their life-saving medical treatments. The entire medical system in the US is a human rights violation. So we're fighting the ruling class and their for-profit healthcare system for our very survival. And we do this in solidarity with everyone around the world who also suffers from the violence of the US state.
We, the people of the US, charge that the US government has no right to talk about human rights and democracy. How can a country that jails and imprisons 2 million people talk about human rights? How can a country that detains 35,000 immigrants every day talk about human rights? How can a country that restricts voting rights and access to the ballots talk about human rights? And every day, people in the US struggle to get clean water, to get housing, to get health care. We are about to face an unprecedented housing epidemic, an eviction epidemic in the US. And so we, the people of the US, say no. The US has no right to preach about human rights and has no right to talk about democracy until it fixes the problems it has at home.
A country that was founded on and could not exist without the attempted erasure of indigenous peoples. who charges water protectors and land defenders under the rubric of terrorism, who surveils its Arab and Muslim population, who forces people to become informants in their own community, who runs torture centers from Abu Ghraib to Guantanamo, and who not only does not admonish, but continues to give $3.8 billion every year to Zionism to continue the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Any country that does this does not have any leg to stand on to tell.
As an organizer in the United States, I too often see our communities coming into contact with the so-called criminal justice system. We are targeted because we are poor or workers. We are targeted because we are Black or brown or migrant. We are targeted because we are queer or trans. In this context, I know that human rights is not just the absence of injustice, it's also the presence of basic human needs like healthcare, housing, and education. It's the presence of a society that has organized its political, social, and economic system around prioritizing human life and not profit. And most of all, human rights to me means the presence of love and solidarity, of genuine friendship and belonging. These are the things that are entitled to all of us, and not just the ones who can afford it.
If we want to talk about democracy, if we want to talk about women's liberation, we need to look to countries like Cuba, where there is participatory democracy, where there is a family code, and where women's liberation is something that's being protected by the government.
The United States of America is one of the globe's major violators of human rights. As the United States leads the global capitalist system during a pandemic, it continues to expose in greater detail how its own economic and social inequalities for generations have been endured by the Black community. Black people are dying nearly at 1.5 times the rate of white America. The United States healthcare system is antithetical to human rights. It's an unregulated model that puts profits over the needs of its people. An unregulated U.S. capitalist economy leads to diminishing the quality of life from generation to generation. The Biden-Harris administration should spend more time making the United States a more democratic society by dealing with its own racist and fascistic tendencies. If the United States focuses more openly and transparently on its own domestic issues, as the U.S. Constitution puts it, quote, to form a more perfect union, end of quote, and let other nations pursue their own rights to sovereignty, that is fundamental democracy.
When I think of human rights, the first thing that comes to mind for me is your human right to protect yourself against capitalist oppression, right? Like your literal human right to decide that you won't allow yourself, the people you love, or the rest of humanity to be destroyed by capitalist domination. At the U.S. Summit on Democracy, while the U.S. Conveniently tries to persecute other nations for what it considers human rights violations, there are a few names that are definitely going to go flying under the radar. They are the names of some of the Black political prisoners in the U.S. who have given their lives fighting against this system. And so I'm going to say them here. Mumia Abu Jamal, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, Reverend Joy Powell, Sundiata Akoli, Dr. Mutulu Shakur, Joseph Bowen, Veronza Bowers, Kamal Siddiqui, Josh Williams, Russell Maroon Schultz, who was recently granted compassionate release after 50 years in prison, 22 of those in solitary confinement. They took his entire life away from him, released him on his deathbed, and called that compassion. And we see that that is a model that is going to be followed for the rest of our aging political prisoners as well. Last but not least, Dedan Waikuri, my friend who's 31 years old and being persecuted by Greenville, North Carolina for his participations in the George Floyd uprisings of 2020, because political prisoners in the United States are not just a thing of the past. We see that there is a concerted effort to create a new class, a new generation of political prisoners as well. These are the names of men and women who all woke up one day and realized that the phrase human rights has to mean more than just the ability for corporations to destroy human life for the purpose of profits, and they dedicated their lives to trying to do something about it. There's no human right more precious than the right to defend humanity against oppression, and in the U.S. that right is not allowed or acknowledged. I hope that the people will keep this in mind while engaging the U.S. State Department Summit on Democracy.
To me, basic human rights should include the access to housing, access to healthcare, access to healthy food, access to clean water, access to educational resources and services, and, just basically your basic needs being met. That includes the access to labor to help sustain communities and systems that maintain the health of nations. So with that being said, I hope that all nations, including the United States of America, one day afford all of its citizens these basic human rights.